This morning, for our sermon time, we have the honor of hearing from our very own Phil Newman. Phil is the son of Polish immigrants. He became a surgeon and the husband of Phoebe over the course of his life. He's been a member of UUFM for many years, and we get to hear a little bit more about the memories and moments that have shaped him this morning. So as we hear from Phil, I'm going to pass around some photographs that he brought. So feel free to take a look at those and pass them on to the next person when you've seen them. Please join me in welcoming Phil Newman.
This has been a tough talk for me to get together, and I think it's just because I'm old, at least that was what I was thinking, and that my cognitive stuff is declining, but this is the first time I've gotten up to talk and Phoebe isn't in the crowd. So, I thought I'd read a couple of her poems just to get things started, and they fit in with the idea of the talk of a worldview and concepts about how things work. So the first one actually is a story that we shared. I had spent time in Vietnam and came back. It was a hard experience for me, and I spent some time getting over it. And Phoebe and I were living in Ketchikan, Alaska, and there was a movement to bring there's a small Vietnam memorial. It's a miniature of the one that's in Washington, D.C., and it travels around, and someone has to be with it all the time if it's in your community. And Phoebe had been on the group that had brought it to town with a group of other people, and we sat with it 24 hours a day. And afterwards, she was so moved by the experience that she wrote this poem. And that poem and this poem then ended up as a memorial in the city park in Ketchikan, and it sits there. And one of her favorite things was to go down when the cruise ships were in and sit on a bench in City Park and see who read her poem, and then go up and engage them in conversation. So this is the poem, and it's about the Vietnam Memorial. It's called "After the Departure." For days to come, we will see before us the quick shadows of the names. We will see the reflections of our faces and our tears. Our fingers will trace the letters of the names in our dreams. We will think of the names covering the wall, stretching across our small park from end to end, amid the whisper of alders and streams, the hush, the questions, and grief-struck answers. We will think of the names your mother sang and of the nicknames given in love. We will think of the names repeated and signed, sworn to and saluted, then reported, then listed, then carved. For years to come, the quiet susurrus of our hearts may pause as we remember that we have touched the names, have pressed our lips against the names, have said goodbye again and again, and that because of the names, we will never forget. And that was from 1997. This is a poem that was Phoebe's favorite, actually, and it's titled one of her books, called Ruby. I mostly recall Ruby perched like a bug on the hood of that tan Ford, always whining for a Coke. Nothing she ever had was enough for Ruby. She thought she deserved it all. Miracles come like that, aggravating and homely. Ruby was the only one got out. Nagged herself into that beauty school, did real good, dyed her hair orange, and went on down to El Paso, complaining all the way to marry the sweetest boy in Texas. She came by the house last May, got herself 2 little rat-faced boys. That husband of hers still all smiles. I swear, Darnell, ain't no way to guess what God's gonna love. And a while after Phoebe died, I got this book in the mail. It was a new collection of poetry, and one of her poems that I really liked was collected in this poem. And the book is about motherhood, and this is really autobiographical. Phoebe had a really difficult mama in some ways. So the title is Inheritance. When she died, I found my mother had left me a rhinestone bracelet, 2 thin silver teaspoons, monogrammed, tarnished, the shape of her hands imprinted on mine, a certain hilarious way of operating in the world, a passion for appearances, too many nightmares, yet a huge amount of courage. No recipes, but 37 yellowing dress patterns with gussets and careful pleats, 2 magnificent watercolors, all her clothes filigreed with cigarette burns, a kitchen filled with vodka bottles and spoiled food, every snapshot of me that was ever taken and every letter I wrote. And one more that's not Phoebe's. It just one of my favorites. So it's by Robert Hayden, and it's called Those Winter Sundays. Sundays, too, my father got up early and put his clothes on in the blue-black cold. Then with cracked hands that ached from labor in the weekday weather, made banked fires blaze. No one ever thanked him. I'd wait and hear the cold splintering breaking. When the rooms were warm, he'd call, and slowly I would rise and dress, fearing the chronic angers of that house, speaking indifferently to him who had driven out the cold and polished my good shoes as well. What did I know? What did I know of love's austere and lonely offices? So I just wanted to catch you up a little bit on me. And for those that don't know, I was born at the tail end of the Great Depression, 1938, and in the run-up to World War II, into a small immigrant family, struggling to get a toehold in a small, semi-rural northeast Pennsylvania town, mostly hostile to immigrants and Jews. We lived over the family-run candy store. Mom, Dad, grandmother, Hannah, older brother Sam, and my sister Minda. It was a busy childhood, mostly defined by assimilation, education, and personal responsibility. My mother kept a kosher home, not a small undertaking, especially in semi-rural Pennsylvania. We built a modest family business into a somewhat respectable enterprise and relied heavily on the support of our tiny Jewish community, which was in a state of limited but consistent growth over the first 10 years of my life. After the war, much of our family efforts were directed towards rescuing the remnants of our European relatives. We sent for and met as they stepped off the boats so that the kids, us, me particularly, could witness and listen to their stories firsthand. We'd go to a hotel room and sit, all the little kids on a bed, and the people who had just come over, still with tattoos on, would get translated by my mother, who spoke both Yiddish and English, of course. It was a hard thing to bear for all us children, but it was really the never again philosophy of that culture that I grew up in. The rest of our efforts were to solidify our transition into becoming Americanized and become financially secure. We actually did pretty well financially. We were able to turn our educational opportunities into successful careers and got to live very full lives. But it took a lot of effort and good luck. Between my junior year of, my junior year of college and of high school and my senior year of high school, my father's candy store, which we lived above, was wiped out by a flood. We were no longer living above it. That was when I was a kid. The store got wiped out. My father refused to take bankruptcy and had no flood insurance, so we started all over again at that point. And that meant that I was going to need to get money in order to go to college. And here is the chronology of what happened next. I went to that local high school, played football, in fact, captain the football team, and I was in the concert band. Then went on to Kenyon College, was in Ohio, and had a compulsory chapel, Episcopalian. And I had a scholarship. The reason I went there was because they gave me the most money and offered me the most jobs. And one of my jobs was to hand out chapel credits every Sunday morning. There was an upstairs to the chapel, and during the quiet times in the service, you could hear someone say, 3 clubs. And that's where the Jews all sat. And someone else would say double. One of my favorite memories. It was a pretty good job because I got to take the extra chapel credits, and I could go around and sell those to folks who didn't quite get up that morning. So it was a double income stream for me. From 60 to 64, I was in medical school at the University of Cincinnati. 64 to 65, I was an intern at San Francisco General Hospital. It was really, I would say that was really when I woke up to some degree. I was no longer working with my father. I had worked with my father up until my senior year of medical school. And he was terribly disappointed to find out that I was still going to pursue medicine and not come back and work in the store. But, and I had never been farther west than Indiana at that point. So San Francisco was a big deal for me. And I met my first wife there. I met the people that would then train me for the rest of my life at that installation as well. 65 to 70, I was at a surgery residency at Harvard General Hospital in Los Angeles, and with some time spent in Boston as well. 70 to 71, I was the chief of professional services for the 18th Surgical Hospital in Quang Tri, South Vietnam, and ran the only children's hospital that the Army had during the Vietnam War. That was a long year. It was hard work. 70 to 71, I was back in the United States and in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and then spent the next 22 years there in Los Alamos in New Mexico in private practice. I had been on an academic track up until Vietnam and then changed with my partner who I had met during my internship. And we were in practice until 94, and then I went on to Ketchikan, Alaska, and finished up there and came here. So that's the rough outline. And these are just some of the stories that Ken asked for. One of them is not to pick up phone calls from Ken Moore. Really. He'll leave a message. So Phoebe was a compulsive proofreader and read all the time, and I would be somewhere in the house and she would be reading somewhere, and every time she found a typo I'd hear a scream. And we were trying to decide where to go after Ketchikan, and looking, Portland was too big for us, and we were looking at McMinnville, and so Phoebe had gotten a subscription to the local newspaper, and Jeb Blendine at that point, maybe 3 editions in, wrote an editorial about the wonderful people that lived in this community. And she was reading that particular edition of the newspaper, and I heard her screaming. And there was a typo and he was talking about the wonderful, kind, and gentle people that live in this town. But gentle came out as Gentile. So Phoebe wrote a long letter saying we were thinking about moving to McMinnville and wanted to know if we should change our mind. And he wrote back a wonderful, long 3-page letter, which she still had. It was really lovely, but that was one of them. Just some of and just in no particular order, just some of the stories that came to mind about all of this review. One was that my partner is a big guy, and he grew up in Arizona and lived mostly a rural life, and I had just arrived in San Francisco, didn't know anyone. I'm looking out the window of San Francisco General Hospital, and I see a Jeep drive in, an old Army surplus Jeep. And there's a guy driving it, and he's got nothing but camping gear on the back side of it, and it's all open to the air. And he pulls into the intern parking lot, and I said, I've got to meet this guy. And he turns out to be the man that I ended up being in practice with for 24 years, and we still are really close friends. He pulled in and was not used to being in a big city. He dropped off his clothing to get cleaned at a dry cleaning place on the way in to the hospital, and immediately forgot where that was. So we spent the rest of the year searching for his clothing. And he's wearing scrub suits, and they never found it. So he and having no money, we were getting $110 a month to live in San Francisco. He lived in scrub suits for the rest of that year. The other story about Michael is that he and I that same year had a 1-week vacation. We had to take it all at one time, and we decided we would go to the Four Corners. I had never been to the West. I knew nothing about the West at all, and it was winter we're driving across the great Navajo Nation, just the two of us, and we had stopped off in Las Vegas and played poker all night. And we're driving in a snowstorm, and it's blowing horizontal. We pass a huge field filled with cows, and another thing I'd never seen. And as we drive by at a fairly brisk speed, and I'm driving, Michael says, I wonder what that cow does about flies. And I said, what cow? He said, the one without a tail. I said, Michael, there are like 3,000 cows in that field. And he said, yep. So I turned around because I didn't believe him. And when we drove around and looked at the field, there was one cow without a tail. And he saw it. And I said, this guy's interesting. I need to pay attention to him. And in fact, his attention to detail was just that. It went on for the rest of his life. He could pick out cows without a tail in the middle of a snowstorm. Phoebe and I lived on 2nd Street in 2nd Avenue in Ketchikan, and there weren't many Jews in Ketchikan. There were a few, and they were very visible on around, but not a large population. And one day I look up, and there's a guy moving in across the way that looked sort of like me. And we talked for a while. His name was Ron Adler, and he turned out to be Jewish. And not only that, his uncle had bought my father's business when my father finally sold it. And Ron was in town for about 3 months, and it was the cruise ship season, and he was walking around downtown, and a man comes off the cruise ship and picks him out as being Jewish and walks up to him and said, can you tell me where the Jewish Community Center is? He said, well, I don't know, but I can tell you where the Jewish neighborhood is, which was our block, because we lived across the street from each other. A high-density Jewish neighborhood. One of the other stories of it that had a lot to do with my life development was, I told you about the flood that occurred. My father's business was in the flood section, and it was wiped out. He was there when it flooded. It was a flash flood, and he was taken out of the 2nd floor of his business. And we were all at home and waiting to find out what happened. Of course, we couldn't communicate with him. There were no cell phones back then. He finally drives up with all the people in that neighborhood, which was a fairly industrial, rundown section of the town, and he's in a boat, and we take everybody home that were neighbors of the store. In the morning, I got up and was heating up water on a charcoal grill out in the backyard, and I come in and I see my father in the kitchen, and he's going around stuffing $5 bills into everybody's purses who's been staying at the house. And that's the kind of guy he was. We never talked about it, but it was one of those things that stuck with me the rest of my life. One of the other stories that came to mind is that when I was in Los Angeles, I was completing my residency. I was a 5th-year surgery resident, which means that I wandered around the hospital with a small army of people, a couple interns and students and residents, and I had a man who needed an operation at 4 o'clock in the morning, and we were going through a tunnel, and I had met this gentleman in the emergency room. We talked, and I told him how serious this was and what a difficult problem, and he needed an immediate intervention. And he was really a sweet guy, and we developed a very quick relationship. And we're walking, I'm pushing his gurney, and we're walking down this tunnel. And he said, I forgot to ask you one thing, Doc, and that's, what's your religion? And I told him I was Jewish, and he said, well, I can't do that. I won't have a Jew cut on me. I just won't do it. And I said, you know, this is really serious risk for your outcome. And he said, nevertheless, and everybody in my group cheered because they could go back to bed. But he was adamant. I finally had to find another hospital that would take him and get him transferred. It was a remarkable event for me to find someone that was so a reasonable appearing man who was so committed to this belief that I could do him harm from my religion that he wouldn't have me do his surgery. Never saw him again. Had no idea what happened to him, but he comes to me in the middle of the night every now and again. I also had a nurse that I worked with. Her name was Ginger, and she was Irish, and she had a temper, and she was a most wonderful woman. And she had a large family. She had been a nun for a while and stopped that, had about 7 kids, and she just took in me and my 2 children, and we became sort of a melded family. And we worked together for 20 years. And we had days that were difficult. And we were having one of those days, and we'd been fighting back and forth all day and hardly talking to each other. And I was doing a history and physical on a man who was going to have surgery the next day. I'm standing in back of him, and I have my scrubs on. And Ginger is in front of him, and Ginger is waving at me. And I finally take the stethoscope out of my ears, and I said, Ginger, what do you want? And she said, doctor, and I knew when she called me doctor that was not good. She said, is that your phone? Is that your wristwatch? And I have a wristwatch on. And I also have a terrible hearing problem. And I said, Ginger, whose watch do you think it would be? And she said, Doctor, you're such an asshole. And this man said, could we change our... Could we postpone my surgery for a while? And he did. The other thing was that Michael, my partner, the fellow that I was telling you about, he also spent a year in Vietnam, and we were on a track to. The reason we were in New Mexico was because we were both on a track for an academic. We both had jobs in an academic setting, and I decided to go into community private practice that would be really personal and mostly about relationship rather than getting into an academic setting. And so that's how we ended up in New Mexico. There's a story that also involves Phoebe. In my second year of medical school, we were still doing non-clinical classes in those days. It wasn't, the first 2 years of medical school were dedicated to non-clinical studies, to basic studies, and I had taken a neurosurgery, neuroanatomy test, and it was terribly difficult. And I was really angry, and I had made arrangements to meet some friends who were also taking the test at a bar afterwards to talk about it. And I was sitting at the bar drinking some beer, and I called up Phoebe, who I hadn't seen in a long time, and she's now living back again in Florida. And by the time these rest of the folks came, I had made a decision to go to to drop out of medical school and give this up and go. And the three guys that came out of the test joined me. So we all piled into my car in the middle of medical school and headed south, well lubricated with a little bit of beer, and drove to Florida and picked up Phoebe. And everybody else made their way back to Cincinnati, and I stayed in Florida with her. And we were driving along in a little town, and it was just a crossroads called Ocala, and there were four corners, and on one corner there was a gas station, and the other corner there was a bar, and the bar was owned by a couple named Boots and Buck. And my car broke down right at that gas station. It wouldn't go. And I had no money, essentially. And Boots, and we went across the street to the bar. We went to the gas station. He said he could probably fix it, but it would need parts and labor and usual thing. And so we went over and got a job with Boots and Buck, tending the bar and working for them. And they turned out to be wonderful characters. And we stayed there for about a week and tended bar and knew everybody in town in about 2 days. It was a wonderful fit. But the people in the bar talked me into going back to medical school. And the disappointing part was I went back after a week and nobody even noticed that I was going. When I was in Vietnam, we were covering a significant movement in Laos. There was an invasion of Laos, and we were the hospital that was taking care of this, and really busy, and there was a lot going on, and it was hard to keep up with things. And in the middle of that, a general showed up and wanted to be shown around the hospital, and since I was the chief of professional services, that was my job. His name was General Whalen. And I said, I don't have much time for this because I'm busy, but I'll show you around very quickly. And I showed him around, and he was in tears by the time we got done. And he said, you just got to tell your group that they're doing a great job, and they can have whatever assignment they want in the United States when you're done with your tour in Vietnam. And all you have to do is take down all the names and send it to me, and I'll make sure that happens. And I said, fine, and I went back to work and forgot about it. But I did send him all those names. And my orders everybody's orders came through, and they got what they want. My orders, I sent, and you had to send your preference along. I sent my preference for Northern California, and my orders came through for Fort Dix, New Jersey. And so I sent a letter to my wife, who was living in Southern California at that point, and gave her General Whalen's phone number. And it turned out that General Whalen's assistant was named Major Newman. And I was Major Newman. So every morning my wife would call Major Newman and say, Major Newman, I want to talk to you about Major Newman. And it caught his attention, and instead of having to go to Fort Dix, New Jersey, I ended up in Albuquerque. So that was how I ended up in New Mexico for 22 years. My son was born while we were in I don't know why I put this one in, but my son Adam was born while we were in Los Alamos, and the state of my marriage was such that my wife had a section, and it turned out to be a boy, and we hadn't picked out a boy's name. We didn't have one. And my wife was in the hospital recovering from her C-section, and we were still diddling about what we were going to call our son. And they came and they said, Dr. Newman, we can't send your son home without a name. Got to have a name for the discharge summary. So the best that we could do, which was the state of affairs with that marriage, was come up with a temporary name. We came up with Main Street Newman, and he went home with a birth certificate that says Main Street Newman, and got a whole big bunch of gifts that were printed with that on it, which he still has too. I love that story. When I left medical school and I was heading for my internship, I had never, as I said, been farther west than Muncie, Indiana, and I drove out alone. There was a screw up in the scheduling, and I was in a rush, but I did end up stopping in Reno to play some poker on the way out at a casino, and I'm sitting at a table with mostly older men. I'm the youngest one at the table, and we've been playing for a long time, and there's the same dealer, and he's a really old guy. And a brash young man comes and sits down at the table, and he's really, really obnoxious, very difficult and loud, and irritates everybody at the table. And finally he gets a really good winning hand, and he plays it really badly, and he makes no money, and he's pulling in what small amount of chips that he has. And the dealer looked over and said, "Son, you played that hand like a foot." And he got up and left the table. When I started my surgery residency in Los Angeles, I got married the first week of my residency, and my wife and I took a weekend honeymoon with 3 other people. Yeah. And because the Watts riots were on. I'd grown up, as I said, in an immigrant family, and had lived in a small town. I went to University of Cincinnati, was the biggest city I'd lived in, but University of Cincinnati Medical School was really pretty unsophisticated. It was confined to studying most of the time. And so I didn't have a lot of political viewpoints about much at all. And then the Watts riot happened, and watching the emergency room, dealing with the Watts riot from the emergency room, and watching Watts burn, and watching how the police manage folks was an enlightening, politically activating experience for me. I mean, the police were very brutal. Everyone was inflamed. It was a difficult time. They were routinely bringing in black patients, handcuffed, 2 guys holding onto their legs and bouncing their head across the emergency room floor of the patient as they brought him in. I mean, that was sort of standard deal. And it really had a huge impact in driving my political views for I think the rest of my life. I haven't observed that. I've already warned you about taking calls from Ken Moore. And I just have a couple more stories. One is that when I was a kid in Strasbourg, there was a Jewish community, but there wasn't a rabbi. This was 1938, and this group of mostly immigrant Jews in this little town got enough money together to hire one, and he turned out to be a guy by the name of Kurt Weimer, and he was from Germany. and he was single, and he needed a place that he could get a kosher meal, and that was my mother's home. So he would come to the house and eat with us often, and became very instrumental in being a mentor to us kids. And before I graduated from high school, he had left that job and had gone back and gotten a degree in history and became a pretty well-known historian at the collegiate level, and published a number of things. And he remained a very close ally with my family, and whenever I came back to town, I would visit Kurt, and we'd spend time together. He was really close. The last time I saw him, I went back. Kurt was in his 90s by that time, and my brother had a tragedy in his family, and we were sitting Shiva for one of his sons who had died, and someone brought Kurt into my brother's home so he could be there to be a minion for the Shiva services. And the man who was taking care of Kurt came over and said, "You may not know this story, but do you know why Kurt used to come to your house and have dinner?" And I said, "Sure, because my mother could provide him with a kosher meal." And he said, "No, that wasn't it. It was that Kurt had a crush on your mother." And it's one of those things you only find out about if you've been in place for a long time. I mean, this was like 40 years after knowing this. So it was a great reminder, of just being in place. That's really all I have to say. Have you got any questions?
So one more.
Not you.
How you became a doctor? Why you became a doctor?
Oh, I forgot that story. You didn't. You embarrassed me on so many levels.
If you want to hear how Phil became a doctor, you find him after the service.
I will tell the story. It's a great story.
We're going to give him a break.
So I'm working for my father, and I get the papers from Kenyon College that I need to sign up for a major, and it's a thick packet, a manila folder, and it's got all these instructions. There are at least 5 pages of instructions on how to fill out this form and how to get on with it. And I'm working like from 6 o'clock in the morning till 10 at night. It's a busy time of year. It's a resort area from New York City and Philly, and I just don't have time for this, so I put it aside. And the next day comes a postcard from Kenyon College, and it said, "We made a mistake, but if you're going to be a pre-med major, all you got to do is check this box and forget about the manila folder," which I did. I said, I can always change this. It didn't work.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Phil.